The Lost Keeper. I was never much of an ocean guy. Sure, some people love the smell of salt air, the sound of waves crashing, the romance of the open sea. Me? I never saw the appeal. I like solid ground beneath my feet, thank you very much. But a job's a job, and when you're low on options, you take what you can get, even if it involves being stuck on a tiny, desolate island in the middle of nowhere, keeping watch over an ancient lighthouse. When I got the offer, it didn't seem so bad. The pay was decent, and I figured how hard could it be? Sit in a lighthouse, keep the light going, and maybe spend my time catching up on books or picking up a new hobby. I was promised peace and quiet, and with no internet, no noisy neighbors, and nobody around for miles, I'd definitely get that. So, I packed my things, said goodbye to civilization, and hopped on a boat that dropped me off on what felt like the edge of the world. The first week went exactly as expected. It was boring, almost comforting in its monotony. I'd wake up, check the light, drink endless cups of bad coffee, and listen to the wind howling against the stone tower. Occasionally, I'd spot a ship passing in the distance, and I'd give a half-hearted wave even though no one could possibly see me. All in all, it was the quiet life I'd signed up for. But then, one evening, as I was poking around, trying to figure out how many different ways I could fry the same can of beans, I found an old journal. It was tucked away in the back of a drawer, buried under some rusty tools and forgotten maps. The cover was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age. The name inside the front cover, Thomas Burns. Thomas, it turned out, had been the previous lighthouse keeper. I vaguely remembered hearing something about how he'd disappeared under mysterious circumstances, but I hadn't thought much of it at the time. People come and go in these isolated jobs, I figured. Maybe he'd gotten bored, packed up, and left without a word. It's not like anyone would notice right away. Curious, I started flipping through the journal. The first few entries were what you'd expect, notes about the weather, repairs that needed to be made, and mundane complaints about the isolation. Pretty standard stuff. But the further I read, the more unsettling things became. Around 2 weeks in, the tone shifted. Thomas started writing about strange noises in the night, scratching sounds, like something was trying to claw its way through the walls. Then there were the shadows. He said he'd see them moving out of the corner of his eye, always just beyond his line of sight. He'd look up, and they'd be gone, but he could feel them watching him. The worst, though, were the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the wind was playing tricks on him. But over time, they grew louder, more distinct. He started writing about how they would call his name, night after night, beckoning him to come closer, to listen. I chuckled to myself as I read it. Poor guy must have gone stir-crazy out here. Can't say I blamed him. Weeks of isolation would mess with anyone's head. Still, I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. That night, I went to bed with the wind howling outside, the journal's strange entries bouncing around in my mind. I was halfway between sleep and waking when I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Soft, deliberate, coming from the floor above me, the light chamber. I sat up, heart pounding. I knew for a fact that I was alone on the island. I grabbed the flashlight from beside my bed and hesitated for a moment, telling myself it was probably nothing. The wind, the old structure creaking, but the sound was unmistakable. Footsteps. I climbed the stairs, flashlight trembling in my hand, and pushed open the door to the light chamber. Nothing. The light was spinning in its slow, endless rotation, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. I stood there for a few minutes, my nerves on edge, but the sound was gone. I convinced myself I was imagining things, chalking it up to a mix of exhaustion and too much reading before bed. But the next night, it happened again. And this time, the footsteps were louder. I kept hearing them, always upstairs, always when I knew I was alone. Then, things escalated. Objects began moving on their own. At first, it was small stuff, a cup would be in one place when I'd swear I left it in another. My keys would vanish, only to turn up in a completely different room. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was just being forgetful, but it was getting harder to ignore. Then came the whispers. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into my coffee, when I first heard it. It was so faint I thought it was the wind at first, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. A low, insistent murmur, like someone talking just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a rhythm to it, a cadence. And it was coming from the walls. I bolted upright, my pulse racing, and scanned the room. Of course, nothing was there. I laughed nervously, running a hand through my hair, and tried to calm down. "Okay, this is ridiculous," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. But the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow louder the more I tried to ignore them. Soon, they were all I could hear, like someone speaking in a language I didn't understand but knew was meant for me. And I swear, I could hear my name. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the time morning rolled around, I was a wreck, bloodshot eyes, jittery hands, and a growing sense that I needed to get the hell out of there. I kept thinking about Thomas and his journal. Had he heard the same things? Had he left the island to escape it, or was there a darker reason why he'd vanished? I tried to stick it out for another day, but the whispers came back, louder and more insistent than ever. The footsteps were no longer confined to the light chamber, I heard them right outside my door, pacing back and forth, waiting. I packed my bags the next morning. I didn't care about the job, the paycheck, or my pride. Whatever was going on in that lighthouse wasn't something I was equipped to handle. I left the journal exactly where I'd found it, tucked away in that drawer, like a warning to the next poor soul who decided to take up residence. As I boarded the boat back to the mainland, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shore. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know. You can call me a coward, but let me tell you, there's something out there, something that doesn't belong in our world. And if you ever find yourself working in a lighthouse, my advice is simple: don't go poking around where you don't belong. And for the love of all things, leave any old journals where you found them. I've learned one thing from that experience: curiosity may not kill the cat, but it'll sure as hell drive you insane. The Phantom Ship. Growing up, I was that kid, the one obsessed with ghost stories, pirates, and anything even remotely spooky. You could catch me at the library, checking out books on haunted ships and lost crews, or glued to the TV, watching old black and white horror films about doomed sailors. My friends thought it was weird, but I didn't care. So, when I landed a job as a lighthouse keeper on a small, misty island, I thought, this is it. Finally, my chance to see something truly supernatural. I told myself it was just a fantasy, that it was just a job like any other. But a tiny part of me secretly hoped I'd run into one of those ghost stories I'd grown up loving. I didn't have to wait long. It was a foggy night, the kind where the mist clings to everything, turning the world into a soft blur. The light from the lighthouse barely penetrated the thick fog, and the waves slapped lazily against the rocks below. I'd been sitting in the tower for hours, sipping lukewarm coffee and listening to the distant hum of the foghorn, when I spotted something out of the corner of my eye. A ship. At first, it was just a dark shape in the distance, moving slowly through the fog. Nothing unusual about that, I thought. But as it drew closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I grabbed my binoculars and took a closer look. It was an old, weathered vessel, like something straight out of a pirate movie. The kind of ship you'd expect to see in history books or on the set of a film, with its tattered sails and cracked wooden hull. But there was no crew. No lights. No sign of life. Just a ghostly silhouette cutting silently through the mist. I frowned and radioed the Coast Guard. "This is Lighthouse Station 21. I'm seeing an unmarked ship in the fog, heading west. Any record of a vessel in the area?" The crackle on the other end of the radio was all the response I got for a few seconds. Then the Coast Guard operator replied, "Negative, Station 21. We don't have any ships in your vicinity. Must be an illusion. Fog can play tricks on the eyes." I hung up, but my gut told me this wasn't just a trick of the light. The ship was still there, slowly gliding through the fog, completely undisturbed by the rough waves. I watched it for what felt like hours, unable to tear my eyes away. And then, just like that, it vanished. 1 second, it was there, clear as day, and the next, gone. Swallowed by the mist as if it had never been there. I blinked, wondering if I'd just imagined the whole thing. Maybe the Coast Guard was right. Fog does weird things, after all. I finished my shift and tried to shrug it off, but the image of that ship haunted me through the night. The next morning, I went into town to pick up supplies. As I was chatting with one of the old-timers, Bill, a local fisherman, I casually mentioned the ship. His face went pale. He put down the net he was working on and looked at me like I'd just told him I'd seen a ghost. "You saw the Mary Celeste, didn't you?" I raised an eyebrow. The Mary Celeste? Wasn't that some old ship from 100 years ago? Bill said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The Mary Celeste disappeared in these waters more than a century ago. No one knows what happened to the crew, they just vanished, leaving the ship adrift. Some say the ship's been haunting these waters ever since, showing up on foggy nights. Anyone who sees her, he trailed off, shaking his head. I chuckled nervously. "You're messing with me, right?" But Bill wasn't laughing. He just looked me dead in the eye and said, "Watch yourself, son. The sea keeps her secrets, and some of them don't like being disturbed." I left the conversation feeling unsettled. Could it really have been the Mary Celeste? I'd heard stories about ghost ships, sure, but this seemed like a tall tale, something the locals passed down to scare newcomers like me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd seen wasn't just some illusion. For the next few weeks, every time the fog rolled in, I'd keep a close eye on the horizon, half expecting to see that ghostly ship reappear. And it did. One night, the fog was so thick you could barely see 5 feet in front of you. I was up in the tower, keeping watch, when I saw it again, sailing slowly through the mist, exactly as it had before. The same ship. The same eerie stillness. Only this time, something was different. As I peered through my binoculars, I noticed movement on the deck. A figure. It was faint, barely visible through the thick fog, but I saw it, a man standing at the helm. His clothes were old-fashioned, tattered, like something out of a painting. And then, slowly, he turned to face me. His eyes, dark, hollow, seemed to stare straight through me, sending a chill down my spine. I froze, my hands trembling as I lowered the binoculars. When I looked again, the ship was gone. No splash, no sign that it had ever been there. Just the silent, swirling fog. I didn't sleep much that night. For the next few months, I saw the Mary Celeste more frequently, always in the same thick fog. Sometimes she would appear briefly, other times I'd watch her for what felt like hours. But she never approached, and the figure on the deck never came any closer. It was like the ship was trapped in some eternal loop, forever drifting through the misty waters. As the weeks passed, I started to accept that maybe some mysteries were better left unsolved. The sea had her secrets, and I was just a temporary visitor in her domain. But I wasn't scared anymore. The ship, as haunting as it was, never brought harm. It was like a phantom, passing through without ever fully touching our world. The last time I saw the Mary Celeste was during a storm. The waves crashed violently against the cliffs, and the fog was thicker than I'd ever seen it. As I watched, the ship appeared one final time, illuminated by a flash of lightning. She sailed slowly through the mist, and for the first time, I felt a strange sense of peace. The figure on the deck raised his hand in what I could only describe as a salute, and then, as quickly as she had appeared, the Mary Celeste vanished for good. I never saw her again after that. Some say the ship is still out there, drifting through the fog, waiting for someone else to catch a glimpse of her. But for me, that final sighting felt like a goodbye, like the ghost of the Mary Celeste had finally found her way home. And as for me, well, I still keep watch from the lighthouse, but I know now that some things are better left to the fog. The light beneath the waves. I come from a long line of fishermen. My father, his father, and his father before him, each spent their lives on the sea, following the tides, knowing the fickle moods of the ocean better than their own heartbeats. But me? I liked the idea of staying put, of having a roof over my head and dry feet. I'd seen enough of the sea's cruelty, dragging men down into its cold embrace, never to return. So, when the opportunity to take a job as a lighthouse keeper came up, I jumped at it. Seemed simple enough. I'd keep the light going, keep the ship safe, and keep my distance from the water as much as I could. The lighthouse was on a small, rocky island, barely more than a blip on the map. It was isolated, sure, but that suited me fine. I enjoyed the quiet. No tourists, no noise, just the waves crashing against the rocks and the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. The nights could be long, but I didn't mind. I wasn't much of a sleeper anyway. Everything was fine for the first few months. Peaceful, even. Sure, the occasional storm would roll through, battering the lighthouse with wind and rain, but nothing I couldn't handle. That all changed one night during a particularly violent storm. The wind had been howling for hours, and the sea was a roiling mass of black waves crashing against the cliffs below. I was in the light chamber, making sure everything was working properly when I saw it, something strange in the water. A light, bright, almost blinding, coming from beneath the waves. At first, I thought it must have been a shipwreck, maybe a distress flare or something. But as I stared, the light began to move. It wasn't drifting with the currents or floating like debris. No, it was darting, fast, deliberate, slicing through the water like it had a mind of its own. Curiosity got the better of me. I know, curiosity kills the cat and all that, but I couldn't help it. Something about the light was mesmerizing. I grabbed my coat, threw on my boots, and headed outside. The storm was fierce, rain lashing my face, wind nearly knocking me off my feet. But I made my way to the edge of the cliff, where I had a clear view of the churning sea below. The light was still there, moving faster now, back and forth beneath the waves, almost like it was searching for something. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look, when suddenly the light shot upward, piercing the surface of the water. For a split second, everything went eerily calm, the wind stopped, the waves froze, and then it rose from the depths. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The thing was massive, at least twice the size of a man, maybe more. Its body was covered in scales, but not like any fish I'd ever seen. They shimmered with an otherworldly light, glowing and shifting like the northern lights. And its eyes, God, its eyes, two burning orbs, like molten suns, staring right through me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. The thing didn't move, just hovered there above the water, staring at me with those blazing eyes. It was as if it was waiting for something, waiting for me. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in that terrible gaze. It felt like hours, though it could have been mere moments. Time seemed to warp around us, the storm swirling in slow motion as I stared at the creature. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and sank back into the sea, disappearing beneath the waves without so much as a ripple. The wind came roaring back, the rain stinging my face, and I realized I was soaked to the bone, my legs trembling beneath me. I stumbled back to the lighthouse, slamming the door behind me and locking it for good measure, as if a simple lock could keep whatever that thing was at bay. For the rest of the night, I sat in the kitchen, staring out the window at the storm, half expecting the light to reappear at any moment. But it never did. Days passed, and I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress, isolation, maybe a bit of cabin fever. I mean, I had been alone on that island for months. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. There was no denying the terror that had gripped me when I looked into those fiery eyes. I started talking to some of the old-timers in town, trying to casually bring up the idea of strange lights in the water without sounding like a complete lunatic. Most of them laughed it off, but one old fisherman, grizzled and hunched with age, pulled me aside after the others had left. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer, but the look on my face must have been enough. He nodded grimly. "Been tales about the light beneath the waves for generations. Some say it's an old god, something from before men sailed these waters. Others think it's the spirit of a ship that went down years ago, cursed to roam the sea forever. Whatever it is, it don't mean you no good." I wanted to ask him more, but he just shook his head and shuffled away, leaving me with more questions than answers. I haven't seen the creature since that night, but every time a storm rolls in, I can't help but feel a prickling at the back of my neck, like something's watching me from beneath the waves, waiting for the right moment to rise again. People ask why I stay out here, why I haven't packed up and left that godforsaken island. The truth? I'm not sure. Maybe it's because I know if I leave, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if that light is still down there, waiting for me. Or maybe it's because, deep down, I'm afraid that if I run, it'll follow me wherever I go. So, I stay. I keep the light burning. And I wait, just like the creature beneath the waves. The Keeper's Curse. I inherited the lighthouse from my uncle, Uncle Edgar. A strange man, to put it mildly. When I was a kid, I always found his visits unsettling. He'd show up to family gatherings, mumbling to himself, and every now and then, he'd pull me aside and whisper, "The curse of the keeper, lad. Watch yourself if you ever end up out there." I'd laugh it off and nod, figuring it was just one of his eccentricities. I mean, every family has that one weird relative, right? But after his passing, when I found out he'd left the lighthouse to me in his will, it felt like a bizarre twist of fate. What was I supposed to do with a lighthouse on a remote island? Sell it, I thought. Easy money. But when I visited, something about the place hooked me. The isolation didn't bother me. There's something comforting about knowing you're miles away from anyone, no traffic, no noise. So, I moved in. I figured, how hard could it be to run a lighthouse? The first few months were peaceful. Routine, really, check the light, tend to the grounds, read, eat, sleep. Rinse and repeat. I even started enjoying the solitude, the kind that seeps into your bones and lets you think. But then things started to shift, subtly at first. It began with small things, nothing dramatic. I'd be sitting in the living room, reading, when I'd feel a sudden cold draft. Odd, considering it was midsummer, and the windows were closed. Then the lights would flicker now and then, which I chalked up to old wiring. I told myself it was all part of the charm of living in an ancient lighthouse. Probably haunted, I'd joke to myself. But it was never really funny. You can only laugh so much when your home starts acting like it has a mind of its own. One night, I was getting ready to settle in, maybe watch a movie. Yes, the lighthouse had Wi-Fi, surprisingly, when I heard a knock at the door. Now, this lighthouse is on an island so remote you have to take a boat to get there. Miles away from the nearest town, and I hadn't seen a soul since I arrived. Naturally, I was confused. I opened the door, half expecting some lost fisherman or a hiker who'd taken a seriously wrong turn. But there was no one. Just the wind and the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. I stood there for a minute, waiting, thinking maybe someone was playing a prank. But no one was there. I shrugged, closed the door, and went back to my evening. Weird, but not something to lose sleep over. That's when the knocking became a routine. Every night, around the same time, 2 a.m., there'd be a knock. At first, it was a gentle tap, like someone knocking politely. I'd get up, open the door, and find no one. The same eerie silence would greet me, just the wind and the sea. This went on for a few nights, and I told myself it was probably a bird, or maybe even the wind rattling something loose. I convinced myself of this because, well, what else could it be? Then one night, I decided to ignore it. No harm, right? I'd had a long day, and the last thing I wanted was to deal with some phantom knocker. Big mistake. The knocking grew louder, like someone pounding on the door with their fists. It wasn't subtle anymore. It was angry, insistent, as if whoever, or whatever, was outside wanted in. My heart raced, but I stayed in bed, pulling the covers up like a child afraid of the monster under the bed. But the pounding didn't stop. It got louder, more forceful, until I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. Finally, I snapped. All right. I'm coming. I shouted, more to myself than anything. I stormed down the stairs, threw open the door, and that's when I saw him. Standing in the doorway was a man, or at least what was left of him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and stretched so tight over his bones it looked like it might tear at any second. His eyes, or rather, the dark, empty sockets where his eyes should have been, bore into me. And his smile. God, that smile was the stuff of nightmares. His teeth were rotted, black and stubs, and his lips pulled back into a grotesque grin, as if he found the whole situation amusing. I've come for the light, he rasped. His voice sounded like it hadn't been used in centuries, dry and brittle, like dead leaves scraping across pavement. I froze, my mind racing for some logical explanation, but there was none. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't human. Not anymore. Instinct took over. I slammed the door shut with every ounce of strength I had, bolted it, and stumbled back. The pounding stopped immediately. Silence filled the room, so thick I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I waited, breathless, listening for any sign that he was still out there. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the living room, a baseball bat clutched in my hands, staring at the door, waiting for the next knock. But it never came. The next morning, I did what any sane person would do, I started packing. I wasn't about to stick around and see what happened next. But as I shoved clothes into my bag, something stopped me. A thought, a nagging voice in the back of my head that whispered, what if it follows you? What if this thing is tied to the lighthouse, to the very light I've been tasked with keeping? I spent hours pacing, debating with myself. Leave, and I might be free of it. But what if I wasn't? What if Uncle Edgar had been right all along, and this was the curse of the keeper, passed down from one poor soul to the next? In the end, I stayed. Call it stupidity, call it stubbornness, but something in me refused to let that thing chase me away from what was now my home. The knocking still happens, every night at 2 a.m. sharp. I don't answer anymore. I've come to accept that it's just part of the job, a job no one warned me about properly, but one I'm determined to see through. The curse of the keeper, they say. I suppose I'm living it now. Or maybe I'm just the next in line for whatever comes after. Either way, I keep the light burning. And as long as that door holds, I guess I'll be alright. For now. The signalman's last laugh. I've worked on ships all my life. My granddad was a fisherman who spent more time at sea than on land, and my dad was a tugboat captain, pulling giant vessels into port as if they were children's toys. Naturally, the sea called to me too, but unlike my father and grandfather, I wasn't much for the chaos of fishing or the physical demands of tugging. I preferred the solitude, the steady rhythm of the waves against the rocks, the salt air in my lungs. So, I took a job as a lighthouse keeper, figuring it would suit my temperament. It's a bit lonely, sure, but that's part of the appeal. Or at least, it was, until the night I met him. I remember the night clearly. It was one of those damp, chilly evenings where the mist rolls in so thick you can hardly see your own feet. I'd just finished supper, a can of soup and a dry sandwich, and was heading up the spiral stairs to check on the light. Standard procedure. I was halfway up when I felt this odd sensation, like the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up for no reason. When I reached the light chamber, that's when I saw him. He stood in the far corner of the room, his silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of the rotating beam. He was an old man, dressed in clothes that looked like they belonged in a maritime museum, thick woolen coat, worn trousers, a tattered sailor's cap. But it was his face that unsettled me the most. His grin was wide, almost cartoonish, his teeth yellowed and cracked, like someone who hadn't smiled in years suddenly remembered how and couldn't stop. "Nice night for a stroll," he rasped, his voice thick with gravel, like someone who hadn't spoken in years either. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It was impossible for anyone to be up here, there were locks, for one, and I hadn't seen a soul all day. "How did you get in here?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but failing miserably. His grin widened, impossibly, unnervingly so. "Been here all along," he said, his voice taking on an almost sing-song quality. "Waiting." I blinked, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "Right, well, you can wait outside," I said, trying to maintain control of the situation. "This is restricted access." He didn't move. He just kept staring, his grin turning into a low, almost guttural chuckle. My hand was on the door handle, ready to throw him out, or bolt myself in if I had to, but when I turned back, he was gone. Vanished, as if he had never been there at all. I spent the rest of the night pacing the small quarters below, my mind racing. Was it a hallucination? Too much isolation finally getting to me? I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, still rattled, I ventured into town to ask around. Maybe someone had seen an old man wandering near the lighthouse, maybe he had gotten lost. That's when I heard the story. An old fisherman at the local pub told me about old Henry, a signalman who had worked at the very same lighthouse many decades ago. Apparently, he'd gone mad one stormy night, locked himself in the light chamber, refusing to leave, laughing uncontrollably until he finally collapsed and died. They found him the next morning, his face frozen in a grotesque grin. Now, I'm not one to believe in ghost stories, but after hearing that, the dots connected a little too well. Henry wasn't just a legend, he was here. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't just that one encounter. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing small things. It began with the laughter. At first, it was so faint I thought it was just the wind whistling through the cracks in the tower. But then it became more distinct, a low, rumbling chuckle that echoed off the stone walls. It was always late at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, like Henry was trying to remind me he was still around. Then there were the things that moved. Nothing big, just little things, like my keys, or the lantern, or the chair I kept by the window. I'd leave them in one spot and find them in another. At first, I figured I must have misplaced them. But then I started testing it. I'd leave something in a specific place, only to find it somewhere else entirely the next morning. Oddly enough, after a while, I stopped being scared. I realized Henry wasn't really causing me any harm. Sure, the laughter was unsettling, and having objects mysteriously shift was unnerving, but he never did anything malicious. He was just there. It felt like he was testing me, seeing if I could handle his presence. And after a while, I accepted it. As long as he wasn't causing any real problems, I figured we could coexist. One night, after another brief encounter with his laughter, I sat down at the kitchen table and spoke out loud. "All right, Henry," I said, feeling a little ridiculous. "If you're here, and you're not going anywhere, we might as well get along. Just don't touch the coffee. That's off limits. To my surprise, I heard a faint, amused chuckle in response. It wasn't menacing this time, more like the kind of laugh you'd hear from an old friend who just found something funny. And just like that, we came to an understanding. From that point on, things settled into a strange, but manageable routine. The laughter still came at night, and sometimes I'd find things out of place, but Henry never crossed any lines. He was more like a strange, invisible roommate than a haunting. And I didn't quit the job. Why would I? The pay was good, the solitude peaceful, and as long as Henry and I had our arrangement, I could live with it. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of him, just for a second, standing in the corner, grinning that same wide, unsettling grin. But he never stayed long. He'd just vanish into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but a faint echo of laughter. Maybe Henry had gone mad from the isolation all those years ago, or maybe he just liked the lighthouse too much to leave. Either way, he didn't seem to want to hurt anyone. And as long as he kept his distance, I figured I could handle a little company, even if that company happened to be a ghost with a bad sense of humor. In a strange way, Henry kept me grounded. The isolation wasn't as heavy when I knew someone, or something, was sharing the space. And in the end, I stayed at that lighthouse for years, long after most folks would have left. As for Henry, well, I suppose he's still there, laughing quietly to himself, waiting for the next keeper to see if they're up for a little company. Thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. Your time and engagement mean the world to me. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. And be sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support keeps this channel going, and I truly appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you.